Recording in progress. Is it going to say that now?
Yeah, and it'll notify people
when
they come in.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Can you see it? I think it's recording. Oh.
Yeah, it says recording ... to me.
My internet connection is unstable.
Wonderful.
That's okay. That's great. Well done.
In case anyone wants to know. I'm sure.
Thanks for you two for showing up so far. We're currently just working on waiting for people to show up, so we'll probably give people another 5 minutes. This is the specific room is going to be focusing on organizational workforce and DEI. The other session will be focused more on creating gender equitable, socially inclusive programs. So pick your poison. We will be focusing more on that. There's just one person. I guess I did a good job selling us. We've only got the one now. And Darcy, if you want to talk to us before we start, feel free to unmute yourself. Just giving people some time to come in. Let's see.
Hi. Yeah, sorry. I'm excited about this. I'm just kind of getting situated here. So
yeah, totally. Do what you got to do. Let's see. I need to now figure out how to navigate my screen. Oh, come on. So I can actually. Okay. Go back. I need to just update which thing we're looking at for that. Okay. Hello, Michael. Welcome to our group. We're just waiting for a few minutes for people to sign on. So we're giving people until 20 past.
Got it. Thanks.
Feel like I should start playing music just so that everybody has something to listen to while we wait.
Like elevator music.
Yeah, but like, yeah, maybe something a little more fun than elevator music, perhaps.
What's not fun about elevator music?
No comment. No comment. I don't want to offend any music makers in the elevator business right now.
Yeah, that is somebody's job, making elevator music. And well done to them.
They probably don't make nearly as much money as they should. So let's see. I'm wondering if there's. I'm like, oh, like this was my concern was when we were talking about having like separate breakout sessions. It's confusing, but I'm wondering if everyone wants to go learn about programs, and so only 2 people want to learn about organizational work. It's fine. We're still gonna chat, so we'll have a nice intimate session. Get deep and dirty.
I wonder if people have gone into the main room, or if that's not a possibility for them. They might have gone in without realizing, but hopefully the tech people will tell them to come to the breakout rooms.
I can check the other room and report back if that would be useful.
Sure, yeah, by all means.
All right, I'll do that.
We'll wait for you.
We lost half of our audience.
And I can't see what's happening in the like main section, like if people are chatting about where to go. So,
oh yeah.
I think there's a message saying to the breakout room. So hopefully,
super.
The format is.
Oh, we have another person.
Hello, Tempo. We're waiting a little bit longer for some more people to show up. Someone just went out and did reconnaissance for us, so they're coming back in a second. But awesome. So we'll be starting shortly, but if you need to get a cup of tea, go right ahead. Hello, Sydney. Welcome to the room. We're just waiting for people to get settled in right now because there's been a little bit of musical chairs in Zoom rooms. So we're just getting yourselves comfy, get a cup of tea if you'd like. We'll start shortly. And this is, again, the room focusing on building DEI in organizational workforces. The other room is focusing on programs and gender equitable, socially inclusive programs. So 2 different rooms. Long story why that happened. Don't have to get into it. Just gonna wait for the Darcy to get back, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't actually know why that happened, but going with it.
I don't think not any of us knew how that happened. It just happened and we just went with it.
Okay.
I think it's because we said we wanted to have breakout rooms, and so they decided that we would just have 2 rooms.
Right.
Yes.
And with
And
separate
and here we are.
sessions. Okay. What's done is done.
Yep. We just wait a little longer. We'll wait for once Darcy gets back, we can start the session. And just curious, since it's a small group right now, how are you all doing? If you want to put in the chat box how you're doing, or if you have questions that you want to make sure we try to address during our presentation, feel free to do that. Or if you also want to tell us where you're from, where you work, why you're interested in empowerment, equality, and inclusion. Or you can unmute yourself because we have time. We're still waiting for Darcy. I definitely like it more when we have quiet time in in-person sessions because you don't have to feel like there's dead air because there's just the rumbling of talking. So that is something I miss and look forward to in the future. Awesome. Hi, Sydney. Oh, okay, cool. Hello, Sydney from North Carolina in World Vision. Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you for joining. World Vision definitely talks a lot about DEI right now, so glad that you're here to represent the clan of World Vision folk.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Dimple and I'm from India, and I work in WASH sector, basically in one of the state of Odisha in India, and Odisha is one of the pioneer state in sanitation sector currently, and currently I'm working with the Housing and Urban Development Ministry of Odisha with our funding partner as BMGF. And we work on fecal sludge and septage management in Odisha. And along with that, there are few things which we cover, like for example, solid waste management, and along with that, some part of grey water management also. So currently I'm based in one of the district of Odisha, and I look after that along with district development agency. So this is what I do.
Great, thank you for sharing. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And Michael, feel free to also tell us who you are. You don't have to if you don't want to, or you might be in the chat box of all I know. Oh yes, okay, Life Water, excellent. Nice to see you from California. I feel like Darcy should come back, but since we're kind of 4 minutes or a little more than almost 10 minutes in, I'm gonna start going into this. Are we okay with that? It'll be recorded, so she'll be able to see it. Well, okay, so thank you everybody for showing up today. So my name is Kim. We'll introduce ourselves a little more in a second. So this lunch session is really focused on talking about how do we assess empowerment, equality, and inclusion in the WASH sector. So there's 2 breakout rooms. One is focusing on programs. One is focusing more on the organizational workforce. That is going to be this room specifically. Also wanted to thank the Osprey Foundation for sponsoring the session for the lunch session and hoping that you guys get to learn a little more about Osprey later on in the conference. So to talk about equality, empowerment, and diversity, there's a bunch of different terms that have been used more frequently in the WASH sector recently, especially in the last 2 years. For this specific room, we're going to focus more on the last 3 on this bullet point list: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we often call this DEI. And DEIB is sometimes what we call it, adding a B for the term belonging. The idea between these three different words are a little bit nuanced, but it's kind of important to know when we think about creating equitable and inclusive environments. So diversity, the way we define it in this group, in this breakout room specifically, is really asking ourselves, do we have a diverse group of people from different backgrounds, genders, political views, cultural views, nationalities, race, identities, and all of that in the room, making sure that we're not just kind of having a very homogeneous working environment, because we do see that performance is often dictated by our diversity in our teams. Then when we think about equity, it's really about creating an environment where everybody in the room, regardless of their background or creed, is given the same opportunities to advance, to progress, to be able to promote themselves and succeed professionally. And then inclusion is really thinking about making sure that everybody has the opportunity to provide their voice and their opinions, and in all different, work environments. We add the letter B sometimes for belonging, because you might be doing those first three bits, but belonging is really making sure you embed this in your culture so people actually feel like while they might have the opportunity to be included, that they actually feel like they want to be included and that they feel like they belong in that environment. So that's really what we think about when we talk about DEI, especially in this course, in this session. And when we think about when we're trying to create change and equity and inclusion and empowering people across the board in a sector, there's many different levels that we can do this in. And so this lunch session as a whole is really trying to approach all of these 4 different levels. This is a framework that's originally from the capacity building world of trying to create, better environments through capacity development. And really, if you think about it, DEI and equity and inclusion is a form of capacity development, really trying to make sure everybody feels like they have the capacity to be inclusive and diverse. The first room, that is not this one, is going to really focus more on the programs, which is the beneficiaries and the change agents. How do we make sure that there's inclusion and empowerment in those? Whereas us in this room, we're going to focus more on the outer levels, organizations and sectors, really trying to think about how do we create change and empower our sector and our organizational cultures to be more equitable and inclusive, with the hope that this can also support programming to be more inclusive and equitable. So for this session, there's 5 of us that worked on this research together, that we're bringing here to you today. 2 of us unfortunately are not able to join, but the top 3 people you have on this group are here. So I'll start by telling you my name is Kim Worsham. I am the founder and principal of a new company called Flush, and really along with Kelsey, Georgia, Ruth, and Euphrasia, really spearheaded this idea of assessing what DEI looks like in the WASH sector in a subsection of it, to just try to figure out if we can get a baseline. And with that, I will be punting it off to Georgia.
Hi, I'm Georgia. Sorry, my camera's off because I'm not very well. Yeah, I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds, looking at menstrual health in emergency contexts, and the manager of mine and Ruth's PhD put us in contact with Kim to start doing this work.
Thank you. And Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ruth. I'm also a PhD student at Leeds, and my research is around WASH in high-income countries, particularly the UK, which is a quite an unknown context for WASH inequalities. And yeah, I'm really interested in these questions of inclusion and diversity and decolonizing.
Thank you. And what we were able to do, the 5 of us, with Kelsey and Euphrasia as well, we ended up publishing a paper assessing the about 100 organizations in the sanitation sector of WASH, on what their leadership looks like in terms of diversity and inclusion. With that, so what we're going to try to get through this entire time in this course for the next hour is we're going to tell you a little bit of our results from that assessment that we published. Of course, we're not going to go fully deep into it because you can read the paper, but then we're also going to talk a little bit about the recommendations. And also UTS has created a really great guidance note recently on how to do more assessments of DEI in the workforce, particularly focused on the GESI framework, the Gender Equitable Socially Inclusive Framework. Lastly, we're going to show you some practical tools that you guys can use in your organizations to assess your workforce, both in a quantitative and qualitative way. And one of them we're going to actually play with each other. So we're actually going to workshop one of the assessment types at the end through a mural board. So I hope you guys are cool with mural because we're going to use it at some point. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ruth.
Thanks, Kim. I think we've had another person join too. Lords, welcome. So yeah, I'll just give a brief introduction into our research that Kim, George, and myself and the two other authors produced earlier this year. So we, as we've said, are interested in DEI in the sanitation sector, and we have two hypotheses for our research. The first one sort of coming from our personal experiences in the sector, we hypothesize that the leadership is not very diverse. And yeah, the practitioner organizations are lacking kind of a range of perspectives within leadership. And our second hypothesis for the research was that this lack of diversity in leadership is affecting the work being done in the sector and ultimately is creating sort of an underperforming sanitation sector and will contribute to us not achieving target 6.2 of the SDGs. So next slide, thanks. So those were our two hypotheses, and the background then for our research was that we wanted to investigate the demographics of leaders in the sector and the educational institutions that they attended. So we really thought that these components of demographics and education would affect the power dynamics and the power structures within the sector if there was a dominance of kind of American and European organizations and demographics. And yes, we're interested as well in the headquarter location of organizations, as this would affect where the money is coming from and the funding structures that sanitation organizations have. And then finally, we were interested in these kind of wider questions about how knowledge is produced in the sector and what this kind of means about in terms of decolonizing, because we hypothesized and other kind of research has shown that knowledge is sort of produced very heavily in Western countries and disseminated in those countries as well. And how does this affect diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sanitation sector? So then our methodology for the research was we were assessing 105 global sanitation organizations. So we collected data on 1,472 individual leaders. These included board members, senior leaders and executives, and directors in these organizations. So we collected through a sort of desk-based review and through using like websites, LinkedIn, Google searches. We collected data on gender, race, age, job positions, qualifications of these leaders, and also we looked at the economic status of their home countries and particularly, yeah, as I mentioned, the location of headquarters. We also, just a note to say, we wanted to include disability and sexual identity and gender identity as well, but these categories were not really available publicly, so we didn't include these. But we still got quite an interesting range of data, which Georgia will give us a brief overview of.
Hi, thanks Ruth. Sorry again that I've got my camera off, but yeah, you definitely don't want to see me right now. So this is a visual representation of our results. On the left, you have the overall sanitation leadership demographics, and on the right, you have just the results for the board, membership of the board. So the largest demographic was white men from high-income countries who held over a third of all positions. That's represented by the blue chunk of the pie. Those racialized as white, so that's largely the green plus the blue chunk of the pie, represented over 2/3 of all positions. We also found that white people held nearly 9 times, were nearly 9 times more likely to be leaders on the board for more than one organization than people of color. So this really indicates the large platform for white voices and the systemic preference for whiteness in positions of power. When looking at just men held 60% of all positions. We also found that gaps in representation between men and women of color were larger than the gap between white men and women, which highlights how women of color experience multiple systems of oppression and face greater barriers to positions of power. What was also apparent, go back. Actually, it doesn't really matter. What was also apparent, but not displayed here, were the disparities in the ages of the leaders. So the majority of the white male leaders were over the age of 55. So this shows the difficulty and demonstrates the difficulty for career progression for young staff when there's no space at the top. Next slide, thank you. So this was the demographics by type of organization. So we can see the two at the bottom. White men from high-income countries held nearly 50% of all leadership positions for both advocacy and research and policy organizations, which are arguably the two types of organization with the most influence of the sector. You can see as well in the orange, women of color held the lowest number of positions by type of organization, apart from for research and policy. Again, highlighting the multiple systems of oppression created. Oh, so someone's just started hoovering. Sorry if you can hear that. So we also looked at headquarters, and we found that 88% of the organizations had their main headquarters in high-income countries. 17%, just 17%, had one headquarter based in a country of programmatic focus. We were also looking at educational institutions, and we found that there was a preference for educational degrees from high-income countries, with 119 people having a degree from either Harvard, Georgetown in the US, or Oxford in the UK, so just 3 universities. So not only does this highlight the restricted routes to position of power, but it's also demonstrating the places in which sanitation knowledge is created and disseminated. Next slide, please. So of course, we've kind of created a baseline for the problem that's happening here, but we also wanted to provide recommendations on how what to do with this knowledge. So we took evidence-based solutions from the development, health, and business sectors and created a list of top 10 recommendations that can be followed by either individuals, organizations, or the sector at large. So the first and foremost thing that each individual should do is to acknowledge that structural systems of oppression do exist and pledge to use their privilege and power to dismantle them. With this, we can become vocal advocates for marginalized groups and highlight clear paths to leadership and invest money and resources into training these marginalized staff. This includes advocating for more diverse voices to be included in roundtables and high-level panel conversations. In terms of organizations, they must align DEI with their core values and strategic plans with indicators that can be monitored. So not something that is a box ticking exercise that happens just once, but something that happens over time. This should involve enacting internal policies that promote diverse leadership and inclusive workplace cultures. We highlight many of these recommendations in the paper, but some of them would be recruitment accountability mechanisms and also removing gendered barriers to career progression, such as through creating equal paid parental leave. In terms of the sector as a whole, it can give greater autonomy to different organizations within program countries, as we've highlighted through relocating headquarters and also hiring national workers instead of quote unquote expats. So yeah, we know that these changes take time, but as we're becoming, as the sector and as a whole, we're becoming more switched on to seeing these inequalities and how they continue to be upheld. We can follow steps like these that are, again, evidence-based to start dismantling them. Thank you. Sorry, I need to break my nose now.
Thanks, Ruth and Georgia. So with that, we're going to actually switch to watch a video provided to us from the Institute for Sustainable Futures, focusing on how to create some guidance in providing a database of tools to actually assess workforce. And again, this is focusing a little more on the Jesse frameworks, but is still pretty solid also in DEI. So with that, I'm going to turn it on.
Good afternoon to all and welcome to this session today. My name is Avni and I am a researcher at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. In partnership with a number of Indonesian, Cambodian and global research partners, we have developed a guidance for the water sanitation and hygiene sector to support inclusive WASH workplaces. When considering gender equality, disability and social inclusion, and I will use the term JETC for the rest of this presentation. So for this sector, not only is there a need to look at the people who are benefiting from and managing WASH systems, but also the institutions and workplaces that shape and deliver WASH services. In a way, this document is a tool to support the sector in walking the talk of diversity and inclusion. This document is relevant to water and sanitation utilities, civil society organizations, government agencies, private sector organizations, as well as multilateral donors working on WASH programs, policies, and projects in any context. This document highlights the context and provides actionable ideas, tools, and responses to JETC inequalities across the following 6 stages. The framing of this guidance is adapted from the World Bank Equal Aqua Initiative's Inclusive Water Institutions Platform Framework. Prior to choosing how or what activities to use to advance JETC, it is important to understand what are the values and dynamics within an organization in regard to gender, disability, and social inclusion. We are calling this the diagnosis stage, which can help to assess, analyze, and benchmark against the core JETC issues and understand the potential causes for the same. Every workplace has a different starting point, and a diagnosis can help to identify where to start in your context. The second pillar, called attraction in our framework, talks about understanding the factors that influence who an organization attracts to its workforce and what barriers exist. This can enable WASH actors to strategically attract diverse talent in terms of women in all their diversity, as well as diversity of disciplines in this sector. Continued efforts to attract diverse talent will be inadequate unless there are enough roles available and recruitment policies and processes are conducive to hiring women in all their diversity. The third pillar looks at eliminating discrimination in recruitment processes by understanding the various bottlenecks that women tend to encounter at this phase, such as prejudiced interview questions, gender-biased language in job advertisements, etc. The fourth pillar is about the interplay of gender dynamics and power relations at the workplace, and how organizations in the WASH sector can be supported to retain female and diverse talent and
Sorry about that.
foster an equal and inclusive culture at the workplace. This can range from formal policies supporting family-friendly workplaces, fair wages, accessible facilities, to changing informal dynamics and the unconscious and often conscious bias that shapes who are the decision makers, who has voice and influence, and whether there is support and acceptance of diverse leadership styles. The next pillar discusses the various barriers that accompany career progression and which need to be navigated to reach leadership positions. The last pillar looks beyond the workplace at the various stereotypes, norms, and structures that determine and can obscure visibility of discriminatory practices across the other pillars. This invisible realm penetrates organizational culture and influences decision-making subtly and in a generally socially accepted way. This guidance document is accompanied by an interactive database of over 180 JETC initiatives in the workplace from across the world, drawn from WASH utilities, government departments, CSOs, and the private sector. These 2 resources will be available at the following website from 1st November onwards. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please reach out to us in case you would like to know more about our work. This project was supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade through the Water for Women Fund. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and enjoy the rest of the session.
So with that, what we wanted to do, and I see that we have a couple people left, we wanted to walk through a couple other approaches that you can use to assess how DEI is working in your organization and within your workforce. And we wanted to provide two separate kinds of approaches, one being quantitative and one being qualitative. And we find in DEI, it's usually helpful to do both, to have, the hard numbers as well as having a more qualitative approach to it. With that, what I'm going to be showing you now are just some examples of tools that we found to be quite practical and pretty easy to implement. So the first one is from a group in the US called D5. And what they've been able to do is create a 2-page assessment for an organization to use to just get a quick score on how they're doing in terms of creating not only DEI in their organizational policies, but in terms of their operations. There's a link here, and we can put that in the chat box later should anybody want to see that, but it's easy to find as well. I wanted to make sure I showed an actual picture of the entire assessment so that you can see it's really not that long, all things considered. But of course, this is an assessment that was built primarily for foundations in the US. So there is kind of that limitation. I do think, however, that this is quite an easily transferable assessment that you can do and recreate it for a nonprofit purposes, for social enterprise purposes. One of the things that we really like about this assessment is it does have 5 particular components to look at. And the first one I think is the most important, is looking at the expressed commitment to DEI within an organization. The reason I think this is really important is because while it's good that we all talk about DEI and enjoy the conversations about DEI and understanding what it means, understanding if there's an actual commitment in our vision and our mission and from our leadership in addressing DEI within our organizations is important. There's actually a recent research study that came out from Fortune that found that 51% of white C-suite leaders in the corporate sector actually find DEI conversations to be a distraction to their work, which is why this kind of first component of expressed commitment to DEI is quite important, because it can help us shed information on whether or not we have a commitment to it, or if we're kind of keeping it as a side deal to the rest of our work. The other sections that are part of this, of course, are part of policies. Do we have the policies available for our HR to create diverse staff, to make sure that we are creating diversity within our investment portfolios, or if you're an NGO, perhaps that's about your funders. And also when we look at operations and programs, making sure that when we're implementing stuff, not only are we thinking about creating diversity within our programs, but making sure that the staff that we're hiring and the leadership we're hiring for those programs, and for creating the operational capacity to have those programs, are also representative of the people in the communities, and of our representative of our values, but also are representative of other groups as well. So you take this test and you can basically score yourself at the end, and it kind of gives you a nice baseline to start with if you need to have a conversation with the whole organization. And it's nice too, because it's kind of binary. You have the yes or no question. So, it's kind of, do you have it? Do you not have it? Instead of having to really take more time to consider if you have, a gradient of whether or not you have commitment. It's a little easier than that, I think. The thing we're going to use for the rest of the session, I'm looking at, our groups. It's a pretty small group, but we would love to try this out on you. There's this qualitative approach that we think is a really great one for the sector to try to apply and think about in organizations as we start having conversations about what DEI means to us, but also trying to figure out how to address it within each of our organizations and then the sector writ large. So this is a nice little framework also because it's an easy way to understand that there's differences in the DEI things we need to do. So there's essentially 2 kinds of work one needs to do with DEI, and we need to categorize our different aspects or challenges in our organizations accordingly. So the first one is technical, and the idea of a technical DEI work that we have to do is really easy, clear things that we need to address. So that might be you have to put a ramp in your office space to make sure that it is, equitable for people who have disabilities, or it could be even simply putting in an HR policy that really expresses outright making sure that we have equitable hiring processes. So they're much clearer to actually implement. It's really clear who's supposed to be putting these details in, right? You're not going to have your finance team install a ramp as an example, but also it just it makes it really easy to kind of make some quick wins in DEI. The other one is more complicated. It is adaptive approaches, adaptive change, adaptive management, depending on who you are and what you want to say. But the idea here is really more of the cultural aspects to address in an organization. These are, of course, going to be more complicated and take more time because a lot of it requires learning sessions, requires having a lot of different conversations with different groups of people within your organization and trying to make sure that you can find a place that's kind of a nice intersection for everybody to feel like they are being listened to and heard and accommodated. And of course, this is also going to require experimentations and work that's not just something you do kind of in a 2-month project, but something that happens over a long period of time. One of the things I also want to say before we try to go into this mural and see if we have some time to play with it is it's also really important when we have these qualitative conversations about DEI to try to create a level playing field and not trying to have like a leadership specific conversation and then everybody else, because that's also creating this kind of lack of equity in an organization. We find it's really important for leaders and staff, no matter what level you're at or where you are, to have conversations together so that there's an opportunity for listening, but also an opportunity to really level the playing field when we talk about creating equitable and inclusive spaces. So with that, I wanted to give us the chance to actually play with this idea for our organizations and also for our teams. Ruth or Georgia, would you be willing to put the link in the chat box, please, so it's easier for people to get to? Apparently, I'm not allowed to because I'm sharing my screen. But the idea is we wanted to take these two, qualitative kinds of work and see how we could start trying to brainstorm what are things that organizations specifically need to address in the sector, and where would we categorize it? Is it an easy win, an easy fix, something that's really clear to create, or is it something a little more complicated? And again, it's a small space. There's 3 of us and 2 of you. So also happy to have a conversation instead of a mural, if that's something you guys are more comfortable with. We want to make sure that the conversation, though, isn't this kind of high level, we need to fix HR policies, but perhaps having a little more specificity and detail in it so that we can have a conversation about how do we actually make this actionable for our teams and actionable for the sector. We would love to start trying to create a blog post out of what we talk about in this room. Again, it is a small group, so we can also have a conversation here and we can write notes and try to write about it later on. Because it's small, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Would you rather use a mural board or would you be comfortable having a conversation instead?
Either works for me.
I'm happy to have a conversation.
Great, let's do a conversation. And I might still go to the mural board and see if I can fill it out just to see if we can, because I'm a visual learner, if that's okay with all of you. So Louis and Michael, thank you for being here and talking about organizational diversity with us. I'd love to hear if there are things that you guys in your organizations, we don't need specifics about your organization, or if there are things you've noticed in the sector that you think fit into either technical challenges or adaptive challenges when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Kim, can I ask a question first? Do you think
Sure.
there's anything particular to organizations working in the WASH sector that is different from other types of organizations?
That's a good question. We've had this conversation a little bit between the different authors of this paper. I think, in my opinion, I think the interesting thing about the WASH sector is because it is quite small in comparison to other sectors like agriculture, which is much larger, and public health. I think the thing that's unique about the WASH sector is that there's a lot more opportunity for the sector as a whole to actually develop like useful ways to progress in DEI that other sectors would maybe have a challenge to do because they're much more diffuse. So I think of it as the sector has the opportunity to experiment a little more than others perhaps and see what the results are a little faster. Ruth and Georgia, do you guys have opinions on this as well?
I was just thinking something we've talked about briefly, and I think mentioned in the paper, is that sanitation is very like the infrastructure and the actual programs are very sort of cultural and intimate, and they really need people who understand the specific cultural issues or cultural behaviors that are going on. So I think that's a unique aspect of WASH and sanitation particularly that would require a diverse leadership and workforce, and anyone working in there on specific programs would need even more awareness of those issues, I would say.
Georgia, did you want to chime in? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, go. Was it Lewis talking?
No, go on, Georgia.
Oh, yeah, I think one of the other points we made within the paper was that one of the reasons why the sector is as undiverse as it is because it used to, that water and sanitation particularly used to be very engineering orientated, which of course was a very male dominated field. But now, as we've realized, sanitation, it's multidisciplinary, and it has huge links to public health and social sciences and health and other subjects, other sectors, which again, as Ruth was saying, calls for it to need to be diverse because it serves such a range of people. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I've noticed for years at conferences like this in Stockholm that if you go to the water sessions, they're typically more guys. But if you go to the sanitation and particularly the hygiene session, those are almost always dominated by women. I was looking, I just hopped out of this one to see the programmatic side of this, which has, 25 people in it. So I guess there may be, it's good that there's interest in this and that there's, and it's good that there's interest on that side, but I do think it varies by sector. The other thing I was thinking as I was listening to this is that, it's actually hard to find people to work in this sector. And so it's interesting that, I just thought it was sort of ironic with, that I was listening to that video from Australia about about the things you need to do to increase diversity. And I was thinking, gosh, for a long period of time, it was just hard to find anybody who wanted to work in the sector, let alone making it diverse. So I don't know if the general nature of the sector, and certainly sanitation and hygiene, where there's some cultural challenges, if not taboos, that might make it difficult to apply diversity when you can't get people to begin with.
I think that's a good point. One of the things that we did find, though, when we were doing our research was how many people, especially women that we had talked to, particularly women from African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, talking about how they couldn't find a foot in the door when they tried to get into the sanitation sector as well, where they felt like it was either kind of strong-armed by colleagues who were male, or also for people in low middle income countries. The colleagues that we had talked to while writing this paper was how often it was frustrating for them to try to get into roles when they don't necessarily feel like they have the educational requirements because they don't have a degree at a US or UK based university. And I think that, in the sanitation sector, while sure, there's kind of this challenge of finding people sometimes, I wonder if there's also self-limiting factors where we perhaps have put on a bit of restrictions that have made it so it's hard for people that do want to be in the sector to actually get into it. I know, as an example, for me, when I was trying to get in 10 years ago, really struggled because I have a business degree and not an engineering degree. And people really were not interested in talking to me unless, I was somebody else. So I think there's also questions about what are we asking when we are looking for people to join the sector, and do we have, inclusive ideas of how to make sure we are having a multidisciplinary sector, since sanitation is beyond the infrastructure, and maybe that's also a conversation that we need to consider is who do we need in the sector? Is it a diverse group of people? Do we need to have the civil engineering degree all the time, or can we be a little more flexible with that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, well, Kim, from one misplaced MBA to another, I understand that, but as I've always been on the funder side, that makes it easier for me. I'm also an old white guy, so that also gives me a lot of privilege. But I'm thinking a little bit to the culture of Sanergy, an organization we both know, where I do think one of the things I've sensed, and you've actually sat there and worked there, and I've only went in and out as a board member for a number of years, was that one of the attractions of working there was that the culture was quite different from the traditional Kenyan office in some ways, in terms of, at least as a semi-outsider, could see where it was people were encouraged to have independent ideas. There was less hierarchy. There was, maybe that's not the way you saw it when you were there, but I did notice that there were a lot of women who were in positions of authority and really seemed to be contributing an enormous amount there. But again, that may be less a function of the sector and more a function of the culture of the particular organization.
It's a good point. I think one of the things I would push back on the Sanergy one is the levels of like turnover that can happen. So while it could be appealing to join an organization that has a different culture, does the organization have the ability to also, support people who want to be in a new environment but don't necessarily understand the cultural differences of working for, say, like an American led organization? I definitely saw where teammates struggle or leave because they felt like they weren't supported as Kenyans who are trying to develop professionally in that sense. And I think that there's also that question of, and this is why we focus on the leadership of the sanitation sector also, is because we do find a lot of women and a lot of women of color in the lower level positions. But when we look at people who are running organizations or, calling the shots, making funding calls or making big board related, decisions, those people in those roles were not necessarily looking the same as the people who were doing a lot of the work, on the ground or working as like programs officers. So, and one of the things that we also have talked about as a team beyond the research is also how even like the whole research team on this project were women, and how most of us who are not academics right now, Ruth and George are both in PhD programs, but the rest of us have all gone consulting roads because we just couldn't find opportunities to advance professionally unless we wanted to leave the sector. And when I've talked to women that I've worked with in other countries, particularly in West and East Africa, why they don't stay in the wash sector, particularly the sanitation sector, it's because they feel like there's nowhere for them to go. So they'd rather just go into another sector and try to, progress in that world instead. Even though they might love sanitation, they just don't feel like there's a space for them to develop and become the leaders that they think they can be.
Points really well taken, certainly on Sanergy and more broadly. I currently sit on the board of IRC, which is has hired a consultant to do a review. And interestingly, the program leads in many of the strongest countries there are women and have been for some time. And I would even go so far as to say, I think they have a set of skills that enable them to do a better job that a lot of men don't have. And I think their sensitivity is really quite strong, and they manage to, as a lot of what they do requires working with partners and supporting those partners, but not necessarily from the front, often from behind, and checking their egos at the door frequently. That in some ways that they have a set of skills that is better than a lot of men would be in those roles. There are exceptions to that, of course, but anyway, I don't know. There are certainly there. I mean, one thing you may want to do if this research continues is to there's a, I'm trying to think of the name. There's a type of research where you look at the outliers, the people who have actually who are not
Positive deviance.
Yes, positive deviance, right. And it might be interesting to do that sort of work with women and people of color who have leadership roles and figure out what they did that got them there.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about it is, I think a lot of it is, you know, I guess there has to always be women who are, you know, extremely capable and perhaps like overly capable to get to leadership positions. But one of the things I do see in the sector is that even when I go to like roundtables and conversations, we still, even though there are these women that exist that are women of color who are leaders in program offices, they are not invited necessarily to leadership conversations. So they might end up also getting stuck perhaps in roles where they can't really move on and provide extra leadership in other organizations as well. And that's just something else. It's not, I guess it's not a pushback. It's just a thought I've been having is, you know, I've been going to roundtables recently and it's all, people all look a certain way. And there's just not a lot of diversity to the conversation. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this, you know, to start with is just to assess how are we doing as a baseline in the sector. Of course, there's positive deviance. We absolutely should try to figure out what's their secret sauce. But I also wonder, you know, is the purpose, like, is it most beneficial to look at positive deviance of these women and not necessarily addressing that there are places where we can do a better job creating more opportunities for these kinds of women, inviting them to panels, inviting them to, you know, join boards and stuff like that. Because I think this is, again, something that I think about a bit is we often celebrate the outliers, you know, even in corporate world, or we celebrate like the outliers, the Teslas, the Bezos, but then there's a lot of people doing good work that just aren't getting recognized because they don't have necessarily the resources, or they're not necessarily being enabled to go into that level.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not saying it's a substitution for all the other things. I just thought it might be an interesting line of
totally
line of inquiry. I mean, we, you know, I mean, certainly, at least in this conference, I know there's been an effort to increase the voices other than sort of from headquarters, to increase and we're, you know, we've largely just reorganized the agenda for change to put a lot more prominence with the from the country-based collaborations. Happily, we have a new leader there who is a woman like the previous leader, but happens to be from Africa and have good field experience as a program director. So, I mean, certainly there are efforts to do it, but that doesn't mean that the fundamental problem that you identified in the research is not there. Of course it's there.
Sure. No, it's terribly good points in a good way, terribly in a good way. Good points. And thank you for that. I think that conversation should happen more often too. And I'm glad that we're recording this so everyone else can hear this conversation, because I think you're right. I mean, there's the need for both of those things, and also to celebrate the wins that we do have. And I also just want to make sure, Michael, I don't know if you also have comments or questions that you wanted to ask as well. We don't have to do the DEI categorization. We have about 6 minutes left, but I want to make sure if you guys have other questions, you are free to ask them, or other comments.
None come to mind at the moment. No, this has been really incredible to hear from you all. So just trying to take it in.
Sure, that's fine. And Louis, I do really appreciate the work that you guys have done for Agenda for Change and Osprey. I hope you don't mind me babbling about my opinions on this. And same with Ruth and Georgia.
No, not at all. I'm intrigued by your technical and adaptive seems to, if it's based on the work of Ron Heifetz and who sort of came up with this distinction 15 or 20 years ago.
I think it's not a very new concept for sure. I don't remember exactly where it came from, but it's from one of our colleagues who gave it to us. So, but I can get that answer to you if you'd like.
No. I'm pretty sure I know the source, which was a 2000. Where are we now? 2007. I don't know. 2005, I think, article in Stanford Social Innovation Review on leadership. And anything. I'm gonna hop, but
sure.
It's good to see you and to
see you too.
learn about this, and hopefully we're going to get more organizations like IRC going through these reviews and learning.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. I hope so. Awesome. Thank you for coming on. And I also want to just point out, and Louis, you might already know this one too, so don't worry about it. But there's also just this last bit we wanted to talk about after mentioning these different approaches was making sure that we emphasize that this work that we're talking about in creating equitable and inclusive environments in organizations, it's not just an assessment, it's actually a long project. Again, it's going to take years. And this is something that we got from Equity in the Center, where it's a framework on how to really think conceptually about the journey of creating, equitable, inclusive, and diverse organizations. Really thinking of it from 3 phases. One is being kind of awake, which was really trying to figure out how to create diversity in the organization. What does that look like? Then to woke, which you're really thinking about evolving your culture and making an intersectionally inclusive culture. And I think that's just important to note because, inclusive for one group may not be inclusive for the others. And then the last one is the actual work. And this is probably the hardest bit and the most significant part, which is really creating accountability mechanisms in organizations, which sometimes sounds like lip service, but really thinking about it in terms of creating KPIs that can be measured for organizations on an annual review, particularly for leadership, making sure that they are being held accountable for making sure that their teams are equitable and inclusive, and looking that there's an ability to collect this data. We've shown that we can collect this data across the sector as a baseline. We really want to encourage other organizations to start doing their own internal audits, because we understand that the work that we've done is really just sampling and trying to look at leadership. So what does your team look like across the board? What does it look like in different offices? And trying to identify what are the tweaks and the changes that have to happen, whether they're technical or adaptive, in each of your teams. You might find that one office has challenges with diversity for access to women. You might find one particularly has challenges with diversity in access for younger people. It depends on where you are, and it makes it more complex in a global environment, just because you have a lot more variables, a lot more different kinds of country cultures and organizational cultures that kind of branch off into their own that we have to consider. But it is important when we do this to try to figure out how to create the level playing field globally, even with organizations that have offices in a bunch of different countries. And with that, because I know we have 1 minute left, if you need to get a hold of any of us that did this research, this is the 5 of us. We have our research. The PDF of this information is on the Pathable site in our file section, as well as our research paper. Feel free to download those so we don't have to necessarily wait with this. And it also includes this list of further reading. Some of these are things that we used in our research paper. Some of them are just interesting reads to have about equity and inclusion. The Racial Equity Index, if you've never heard of that, I highly recommend you look it up. It's ran by women of color from across the globe, where they're really trying to look at development as an entire industry and assessing the racial equity of the industry across sectors, which is very interesting. They came out with research last year or earlier this year that was really important to read and also really interesting to read. They've got some really cool upcoming research coming up as well that we really used as inspiration for our paper. And with that, George and Ruth, do you have anything that you wanted to mention before we leave?
No, I think I'm okay. Thank you so much for the session, Kim. You did a great job.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
How do I turn this off?
Mhm.
Yeah.